Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Coptic Canadian History Project's first Scholars Discuss Coptic Studies. This audio blog series aims to bring together junior and established scholars from across North America to offer insight on the research being conducted on Coptic populations around the world. My name is Essam Iskander. I'm a translator, interpreter of the Diocese of New York and New England. I'm joined today by Candace Lukasik, PhD in Anthropology at UC Berkeley, and Michael Akladios, PhD candidate in history at York University in Toronto. And we would like to thank the venue hosting us here today, the St. Mary Christian Center of Staten Island. It also is the headquarters of the Diocese of New York and New England under His Grace Bishop David. We'd like to thank them for hosting us this afternoon and stress that, of course, the views and opinions expressed in this recording does not reflect in any way whatsoever the views of the center, the staff, the diocese bishop, or the diocese. So, with that out of the way, and without any further ado, let us begin by having our participants introduce themselves and their work. We'll begin with Candace.
Hello, Michael. Hello, Essam.
Hello.
My name is Candace Lukasik, as Essam just said. I'm a PhD candidate in anthropology at UC Berkeley, and my dissertation focuses on Coptic immigrant populations in the United States, and also those future immigrants in Egypt. So my project is between Egypt and the New York, New Jersey area in particular. But what I'm interested in more broadly in my work is contemporary Christianity, particularly in the Middle East.
Wow.
Minority cultures in general, and migration, particularly around transnational institutions like the Coptic Orthodox Church.
Mm-hmm.
I've been going to Egypt back and forth since 2007.
Really?
And so essentially, from my first trip there, which was an Arabic program, I've been interested in the church and Coptic religious life.
I see.
So,
Wow. Yeah. How about you, Michael?
It's great to be here in
Welcome
New
to
York.
America. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I started out at York University, did my undergrad, my master's, and now my PhD in history. And my dissertation more or less focuses on the history of Egyptian immigration to North America, with a particular focus on Coptic Christians.
Oh, I see.
Because they do represent the largest Egyptian population in North America. And I began mostly looking at the 1960s, at the development of the first Coptic church in Toronto, which was the first on the continent, and followed that throughout the 1970s and 80s, and more became interested with the middlemen who helped facilitate immigration.
Okay.
And why Copts chose to leave Egypt, what motivated them, how did they get out, and the influence of the revolution on that migration.
Which revolution?
The 1952 revolution.
Oh, okay. So, with that said, I mean, of course, this question is to both scholars here, but Michael, would you consider yourself, or how do you locate yourself within the field of Coptic studies with this description you gave us right now? And do you have limitations, or what do you face?
Well, I locate myself more in terms of my discipline of history, and more particularly the fields of Canadian history and North American immigration and ethnicity. I am involved in Coptic studies, most specifically because I study a Coptic community.
Yes.
And
your community.
my community, yes.
Okay.
I was born and raised Coptic.
Okay.
And in studying that community, you need to, of course, read the fascinating literature that's been written in Coptic studies.
Yes, of course.
And to engage with concepts that relate to this community and its historical experience and its more contemporary experience as a minority in a Muslim majority country, and as its ethnic and by ethnic I mean Egyptian, its ethnic and its religious distinctiveness in North America.
Okay. And Candace, I mean, we introduced this as PhD candidate for anthropology, but could you elaborate a little bit more to where do you locate yourself in studies?
Well, I would say that while I locate myself in Coptic Studies as a subfield, I guess you could say, I'm also a researcher of Coptic Studies in the sense that I'm interested in how different researchers spanning, from the 2nd century until today.
That's a lot of researchers.
It's a lot of researchers, both historians, linguists, philologists, anthropologists now.
Okay.
I'm interested in how they form a field called Coptic Studies, and interesting experience last year when it was my first time going to the Coptic Congress,
Yes.
which was in Los Angeles.
There's a Congress?
And
There's a Coptic Congress?
Congress denotes that it's an international conference.
Oh, so they don't have like a Capitol Hill building out there, and
No,
okay, because that
no.
would be interesting.
But it's a wonderful opportunity to bring the best scholars in this field called Coptic Studies together. It happens every 4 years,
Oh,
and
okay.
it was definitely a ethnographic experience for me in the sense that I was also, in participating in it, I was observing the ways in which Coptic Studies was discussed and how scholars interacted around it and who was there. Clergymen, secular scholars, Copts, non-Copts, people from Egypt, people from Europe, etc. So that's what I would say. I locate myself in the field as a wanderer, trying to also think about where is this going and how is it growing.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's a growing study. Like
Yeah.
there's more interest that's being generated in it by time.
If I may ask,
Yeah.
would you share maybe some of your experiences at the Congress?
Yeah, sure. I think what was really fascinating about the panels that I attended, and again, the Congress in recent sessions has been split up into different periods. So there'll be panels that are geared towards more of the contemporary period. That's only a recent occurrence, and then those that are in the pre-Islamic period, let's say, which is the most robust area of Coptic studies. And what I found interesting about in the contemporary panels is that local clergy members, local in terms of Los Angeles, but also clergy members from New York and New Jersey too, were in attendance, and their interactions obviously are also colored by their administrative position in the church. And so I found it very fascinating to have this very unique interaction between church officials and the academics that are studying the history of that church or the history of that people, and the people themselves, because many of the scholars at the Coptic Congress are also Coptic themselves too. And so I find that dynamic really interesting from both an outsider and insider perspective, as an academic and as somebody also personally interested and invested in the church. So that's what I found most interesting, the questions that they would ask bishops and priests, and how it was a space for academics to kind of maybe speak more openly than maybe in other settings to these religious officials. So I thought that was the most interesting and very productive.
Yes, must be a very interesting gathering of those, whether the clergymen, bishops, priests, and of course the academics who are a different intellectual authority in their own mind, which kind of brings me to the next question. This question of, I'm just trying to phrase it carefully here, power dynamics. So you have those spiritual leaders, those priests, those bishops who are overseeing dioceses, and you have those, of course, bona fide professors and scholars, like both of you, of course. So how does that component of power dynamics, if you allow me to use the phrase, affect your studies, or does it do anything, pose anything in the way of challenges? Let's see what Mike has to say.
Well, in terms of in an academic setting dealing with the inherent problems of how can I put this delicately?
It's not a problem, Mike. It's just an obstacle. It's not problems. It's an obstacle, right?
That it can be difficult as an academic
Yes.
to have your opinions and your authority recognized in a religious setting.
Oh, because it
And
challenges them a little bit.
It's a bit of a challenge, and therefore having the ability to bring together clergy and academics that allow for interaction and allow for conversation and allow for common ground to be reached, I think is vital. And I am a big proponent through the Coptic Canadian History Project of allowing those spaces for interaction and spaces for conversation because it's a benefit to both sides. I would argue academic education can be very secular at times. It can be very, very distancing. And at the end of the day, as someone who does, in a way, locate himself in Coptic studies, I study a community that is very religious, for the most part.
Yes, of course.
And therefore, being tied to their religious beliefs and understanding the kinds of conversations that are being had in churches is important for my own ability to write about them with the kind of nuance that is needed and that this community deserves.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I think in terms of power dynamics outside of that setting, I would say that in terms of oral interviews, in terms of dealing with people, members of the community, it helps that I'm a Copt
Okay.
and a guy.
Okay. Oh, yes. That's okay. That's an interesting point you touched upon. So, Candace, I mean, it's basically power dynamics. You described the church as being a transatlantic or transnational, institution. So, would you describe, in comparison to Mike's comments, that these power dynamics are, I don't know, related to cultural ethnicity, or is it just the classical tension between church and state, if you will, of the secular authorities and the religious authorities? How do you, because you're a wanderer, you mentioned to us, so how do you view this?
I would say I completely agree with Michael on the, I guess, like the Coptic side of things in terms of those power dynamics between like academics and religious leaders, let's say.
Okay.
But I would also flip it, and maybe this is the U.S. context more so, the U.S. Academy, but I would also say that what I found like most freeing in going, let's say, to the Coptic Congress, as opposed to, let's say, larger anthropological meetings or Middle Eastern studies, is that Coptic studies, or let's say Christianity in the Middle East more broadly, is not very interesting to people. And it's not because it's there's less things that are happening in it than, let's say, Islam in the Middle East or Islam globally, or Judaism or whatever. It has to do with particular, I think, dynamics internally in the academy, whereby Christianity in the Middle East challenges a lot of kind of the global narratives by which the Middle East is viewed in an Orientalist light, where the Middle East equals Islam. But I also feel that some academics who are very critical, who are critical of Orientalism, etc., fall into this trap by not really understanding the kind of separate lifestyles that Middle Eastern Christians have in the Middle East, but also in the diaspora populations. And so I find myself coming up against that in different academic settings, whether it's like the national conferences, but also being weary of having my work, if it is not necessarily as interesting for those groups of people, succumbing to the interests of right-wing agendas in the United States, let's say, and elsewhere, that would point to kind of the intolerance of Muslims in the Middle East to like pushing out their Christian populations, which is not to say that we don't take the discrimination and persecution of Christians in the Middle East seriously, but not at the expense of labeling, let's say, all Muslims as evil human beings, etc. Narratives like that. So it's a very fine line, I think, that particularly academics in the U.S. context have to walk, but I also would think that in Canada it's the same way, and in Europe as well. And then, like, a final comment I would also say is that power dynamics wise, and we can probably get into this, I think we will a little bit later, is the fact that yes, there are certain spaces that I cannot go into because I'm female.
Like what?
Let's say.
You mean physical spaces or
Physical
discussion?
spaces.
I
would say more so physical spaces.
Okay.
Like, as an example, especially in Egypt, it is much more easier to, have retreats at monasteries, let's say, and to, go to liturgies in hermitage areas, as an example, if you're a male. That's an example.
Like
it's
when
very
the
small
monks, when they
example.
go up the hill or
Exactly.
something, or
So there's a lot of scholars who are able to do those things because they're males. But as a female, I cannot. As a female, I am particularly a young woman. I cannot necessarily be viewed as serious, let's say, as a male counterpart who is my same age, because I look younger, etc. I've come across that in a few interviews that I've done.
So your looks and your gender could sometimes form an impression of the level of your academic seriousness.
Yes. Which is a good and bad thing.
Yeah, it's quite a surprising thing, if you ask me. But okay, well,
I
go ahead.
Just come back. You touched on a really important point, this idea of narratives, and I completely agree with you about how our work can serve the wrong kinds of agendas, particularly because in dealing with this kind of community that has routinely faced incidents of violence and incidents of persecution, it becomes almost like our work could be misconstrued and used for other purposes. For instance, refugee claims, as an example.
Oh yes.
But I think at the same time, as scholars, our work is not only to tell the story of these particular people, but also to document the history. So, for instance, in breaking down some of these narratives of the Middle East is Islam, that there is persecution there. A part of that is to also discuss how that wasn't always the case. That incidents of sectarian tension flaring up in the past decade or 2 or 3 have not always been a constant feature of that region, and should not, and the present should not be broadcast backwards into the past wholesale in order to sell a particular political agenda.
Well, one particular trend that's happening in the present, at least with Coptic populations in Egypt, is this trend of migration. So, I mean, we already kind of began to speak about this from your extended answers, but what are the larger implications of studying the Coptic populations in Egypt and the diaspora, and how does that shape your understanding of the migration patterns and trends that have been very noticeable in the Coptic population? I don't know, who should take this first? Candace, you want to take this?
Yeah. Sure. So I would say that migration is definitely a fixture of Coptic life in Egypt, but it's also a fixture of Egyptian life in Egypt, in different ways.
So all Egyptians?
All Egyptians, for sure, because of the socio-economic situation in Egypt.
Yes.
Currently, and especially in the present period. It has led people to seek places that they could go just in case. let's say.
The backup.
Something-
The backup
plan.
Okay.
But I would say, though, for the Coptic populations that I work with in Upper Egypt,
Yes.
the United States and some maybe a little bit in Canada, but the populations that I work with, mostly the United States and mostly the New York, New Jersey area,
Yes.
it is a huge factor in their lives, whether it is in terms of kinship, so having a nephew or a niece or a daughter or an uncle or an aunt that live in the United States,
Or a
and
second,
come
third,
back,
fourth cousin.
whatever.
Yes.
Live in the United States and come back during the summer to visit, and bringing, the chocolate with them, or, the clothing or things
Right.
like that.
Right.
There are particular connections that have solidified between particularly the United States and especially the populations I work with in Upper Egypt,
Okay.
where it is a mainstay of life.
Okay.
I mean, even you could see this in popular culture. It's not really Coptic popular culture, but for instance, the Ramadan TV show El Kibir Awi.
You watched that?
Which,
Candace?
yes.
That's some good research there. Okay.
It's a very funny show.
Okay.
But one of the characters on that show is El Kabir's, or the Upper Egyptian
Big man.
the big man on the show. I mean, his cousin, I think, or I believe it's his cousin, comes from the United States to visit him in Upper Egypt.
So
Right?
are there subtitles to this, or do you actually, someone explains to you what's going on? Or?
No, I understand it.
Wow, you understand? This is not just Arabic. This is like Upper Egyptian. I need translation for it sometimes, and I do this for a living. Okay, go on. I'm sorry. Yes.
But the point being that I would say that what's very interesting is that Coptic life in Egypt is definitely intertwined with its diaspora counterparts.
Oh.
Whether it's those that are visiting, coming back, whether it's the North Coast or like the vacation areas, etc., or going back to their villages.
Okay.
And seeing their family members and bringing gifts with them.
Okay.
It is both kinship connections, like family connections,
Yes.
as well as institutional connections, whereby the church, particularly in the U.S. context,
Yes.
and I'm sure Michael can say more about the Canadian context as well, facilitates that connection between Egypt and between being in Egypt in the diaspora and then being in Egypt. It is the link between the two, so they're not those immigrants in the United States or in Canada or elsewhere don't feel totally disconnected from their homeland,
Okay.
from Egypt itself.
Oh, wow, that's very interesting. Well, let me kind of ask a reverse question to Mike. Of course, if you'd like to comment on the same question as well, please do so. But on the other side, what does that, what are what unites or differentiates the experience of, the ethnic and the religious and the socio-economic groups in Egyptian society on one hand, but also what impact do these factors now have it on the populations in North America, Canada and the U.S. of course? Have you seen a different perspective on your end?
Okay, well, I'll begin with the issue of migration.
Yes, of course. We are talking about migration.
Yeah. Because I think the question that you asked me relates more to sort of the movement of ideas.
Yes, exactly.
So we'll start with the movement of people.
Okay.
And I agree with Candace that people are always on the move, and that the relationship between Egypt and the diaspora populations is a very fluid one, and it's anchored in many ways by the church.
Okay.
I can speak to charter flights that were organized by churches to facilitate people going back and forth.
Wow. Coptic Airlines.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be it? Okay.
I think all of us in this room have heard of Asal Iswid.
Oh, yes.
Black
It's a documentary for some of us, not just a comic movie. Yes.
Black Honey, which is a comedic interpretation on
It's a
an
brilliant,
Egyptian
it's a brilliant interpretation.
on an Egyptian who is immigrates to the U.S. very young, goes back in his mid-20s, late 20s,
In a ripe old age.
Right.
and
Yeah.
sort of has to navigate the idea of coming home with all the nostalgia that carries, with the reality of what Egypt has become.
Yes.
And in that movie, we sort of realize or see not only what it feels like to go back to Egypt, to be on the move, but
Yes.
also how Egypt survives, in what form it survives in the diaspora.
Right, but for those of us who watched the movie several times,
Hmm.
it's like we obviously can't help but remember, the comic cues, like when he ate food and he got poisoning, or when they're making kak biscuits and he made the gingerbread man, and they asked him what was all this. But I mean, what are the deeper, more profound themes that you could kind of like use this movie to kind of explain to us?
So, in many ways, it is about disillusionment with
Oh,
what Egypt has become.
okay.
On another level, it is about solidifying a narrative of Egypt is the mother of the world will return again.
For the non-Arabic speakers, Dunya
Yeah.
means the mother of the world. We're not quite
Which-
sure what
which
that
is-
entails, but Egypt is the world's
The cradle
mom.
of
The world's mom. That's it.
So it sends that message, very patriotic, very
Maternal.
yes, message about what Egypt is or will be or should be or what have you. But in terms of his experience, we see, and I see myself through him, this idea of nostalgia that fades into disillusionment, and then over time, all you're left with really is that hope of Egypt coming back.
Okay.
I would say, an interview that that we were both participants in. One of our interlocutors was interesting enough that he's been here for, since the 1950s, and he still gets his information from Egyptian news media sources and still considers himself to be an Egyptian. So he spent the vast majority of his life in the United States, and yet he still holds on to, no, I am Egyptian. Like, I'm living here, but it's a temporary thing, even though he's towards the end of his life. And I thought that was, that's not the only case that I think I've experienced, but it's such a profound one to me. It's somebody towards the end of their life still holds on to this nostalgia of the time that they, spent in their homeland, even though their kids and their grandkids are here and they've married Americans, blonde, blue-eyed Americans. They still, have that sensibility, that Egyptian sensibility. And I find that to be striking, very striking.
And that's not uncommon. You run across that so much. Also because Egypt, migration is a fact of life, as you said. In Egypt, prior to the mid to late 1950s, it was a receiving society, right? So
Yes.
walking around the streets of Egypt in like the late 40s, you would see, or at Cairo in the late 40s,
And
you would
Alexandria.
see, and Alexandria, you would
Yes.
see Armenians, Greeks, Italians. Alexandria, you might see Dutch.
Yes.
You might run across people of various ethnic persuasions
Yes.
who are living in Egypt.
Right. It was their America. They came
Mhm.
from their countries to actually get a job
Yeah.
and find opportunity in Egypt, as strange as that sounds in today's world.
And if you
But there
follow
was
that
that time.
story forward to today, you have people who migrate as a fact of life, going to work in the Gulf states, still
Yes.
considering themselves very much Egyptian.
Of course.
They might leave, for instance, they go to Kuwait for a couple of years, come back to Egypt, work as a driver for a while, maybe go to another Arab state, maybe go to Holland for a couple of years on contract, end up finding their way to Canada or the United States, and maybe they stay in the U.S. for a couple of years. They're not so happy, but they have citizenship, so they go work in Canada
Right.
Okay,
because
so
they can get access. So people on the move is a regular factor of
Right.
Egyptian life, and yet you hold Egypt with you because, as so many people I've spoken with in Egypt say, you can't let it go.
so
There is something, I haven't been able to pin it down, but so many people tell me, no matter where I go, I just can't let it go.
So the common phrase that I heard from both of you right now is that you mentioned the gentleman, he left Egypt in the 50s, and he also mentioned that there are all these other foreign diaspora expats in Egypt in the 50s. So when we're talking about the migration of Egyptians, does the 50s seem to be sort of, I don't know, the median line drawn down that divides time, that somehow the socio-political development in Egypt was one thing pre and post 50s? Is the 50s seems to always reoccur as a decade when talking about Coptic immigration. So please speak to us about the significance of this decade specifically as always a measure of time for the immigrant. Go ahead, Mike.
So there's a lot that can be said.
Okay.
I will hit on three things so that we don't take too much time.
That's okay, we're fine.
Of course, the 1952 revolution, the
Yes.
officers' revolution that brought eventually Muhammad Naguib into power, but then Gamal Abdel Nasser, who
Okay.
most people know.
I heard of the guy, yeah.
Yeah. And his particular brand of Arab socialism, which affected the Egyptian socio-political landscape and affected damaged the Egyptian economy for years to come.
For a long time. Let's just say for a long time.
The Cold War context,
Yes, but
which is particularly important for the migration. So
Okay, there we
these
go.
are the 3 points that I'm going to hit on. First, life under King Farouk was in many ways dominated by the British colonial influence.
I see.
For instance, we see on Facebook today many Copts sharing images of playing golf by the pyramids, of the way that women used to dress, the way that the streets used to look, the way that private clubs were
They had these
run.
little cafes and they played the music in the street.
What is usually not mentioned in those photos and the captions that join them is that many of those cafes were restricted to people with foreign citizenship.
Right.
Oh.
Is that many of those playing golf by the pyramids would not be your average Egyptian who would be either serving there or not allowed in.
Right.
That's
So life under the British was not all rosy, and life under King Farouk, who in many ways can be said to be serving in their favor, was not the greatest. But however, and this is something that I would stress, for many people of that generation that grew up under the King Farouk and then saw the revolution and its fallout, they look back on those times in many ways as times when they felt safer as Copts.
I see. Oh.
And that is important to point out.
Feeling safer.
Feeling safer, feeling as members of that society at large, being united as, regardless of religious distinction, being united against colonial
Right.
influence.
So, but is feeling safer, how relevant it is to actually being safe?
Because I think, and this is conjecture,
Okay.
when as an Egyptian you're not safe,
Yes.
then you tend to unite against what makes you unsafe.
You galvanize. Okay.
So the revolution held a lot of promise for people,
Okay.
that this is what Egypt should be. We are in control of our destiny. Much of the anti-colonial rhetoric that was circulating at the time.
Okay.
We are in control of our destiny. We will run our own institutions. Pride in an Arabic culture, pride in Egypt, pride in the motherland, and so on.
Okay.
What ends up happening is pride in the Arabic culture as a way to distance Egypt from its colonial influence
Yes.
ends up becoming pride in being Arab, which Copts do not identify as.
Because it ties into
Most
Okay,
Copts
okay.
do not identify
All
as.
right.
So it creates divisions.
Okay.
And then, of course, the nationalization of businesses, of lands, predominantly lands owned by Christians,
Yes.
and the restructuring of agriculture and of the economy, which ends up creating a lot of problems, especially the introduction of subsidies from the government that makes life difficult economically.
It was different.
And less opportunity. So a
Okay.
lot of young university-educated students are looking elsewhere to create stability, to create a life for themselves and their young families. And as the first emigres were in Copts
Yes.
in the mid to late 50s, mostly because of discrimination in universities, where Copts were not getting as many opportunities for success as Muslim graduate students.
So they weren't hired when graduating.
And they were not chosen for TA positions most of the time.
I see.
So 1957, you have, and this is where the Cold War context comes in. 1957, you have the introduction of a student exchange program
Yes.
with the U.S.
Yes.
Key middlemen, who we can come back to later,
course.
help to facilitate these movements of graduate students, get them
Yes.
scholarships, help them establish themselves.
Yes.
Key families who migrated early help to sort of welcome them.
To lay the anchor here so that they
Yes.
would bring the others.
And over time, the character of the migration began to see students still continuing to emigrate, but then followed by families, students in medical schools and engineering schools, then followed by engineers, followed by pharmacists and doctors and so on.
So there was a domino effect. if
Yes,
it's
domino
fair
effect.
to-
And then by the 1970s, you have the arrival of more Muslim immigrants from Egypt to Canada and the United States.
I see.
But the dominant proportion has always been and continues to be Christians from Egypt,
who are the minority of the
who
population.
are the minority of the population there, but the majority of the immigrant population.
Okay. So, Candace, how does the period of the 50s and this very thorough historic narration that Mike provided for us, how does that sit in your study? How do you view it, or how do you understand it?
Well, I mean, the 1950s are important for my study, but because I'm mainly focusing on immigrant populations today and over the past, let's say,
Yes.
10 years,
Yes.
especially around the 2011 revolution,
Yes.
I would say though that the 50s are very interesting for the Egyptian populations, or the Coptic populations in Egypt that I work with, particularly in the village that I base myself in the area of Nega Hamedi, which is in the governorate of Anna,
What's the name of the village?
Bahgora.
Interesting.
So-
Bahgora. Interesting name. I grew up in Egypt, and I never heard of that village, but it's fascinating. stuff.
Or for them, Bahjura. So.
Oh wait, I still haven't heard of it.
Anyways, I would say though, for some of the families, the former and current landowning families that I have become very close with
Yes.
in that village, who have a fascinating history, because prior to the agricultural reforms under Nasser during the 1950s,
Yes.
they owned a huge amount of land. Huge amount of land. Some families owned, thousands of fadens or
Really?
acres.
Wow.
And until today, a lot of those families still own parts of that land. But after the agricultural reforms, they either needed to sell it, which some did sell and then actually left to Europe or later the United States.
Yes.
But the point that the 1950s is a pinnacle kind of area, time period for them, is that their influence, these large Coptic families who had influence not only over the community at large, Muslim and Christian, but also within the church itself, because they had a lot of money to influence kind of the direction of certain projects, or of choosing certain bishops, or whatever means that would make kind of the church that they wanted to make at that time, which you could view in a positive or negative light. But after that period of time, after these agricultural reforms, you have these families have less and less influence, which decreases the influence of the Copts at the national level as well, because these people, when they had that influence via their land holdings,
they probably influenced who got into parliament
right,
from these districts,
exactly,
and so on and so forth.
and some of which whose descendants are still in parliament.
Really?
Like the Mukramabids and
Okay.
and those particular families. But it was a period of time where lay Copts had a lot of influence outside of just simply being, religious subjects. They were Egyptian citizens that had, a lot of influence within society.
Yes.
Whereas after that time period, they did not have as much influence, and then decided to either sell their lands and immigrate,
Yes.
or essentially stay in the village and lose their clout, lose their influence. So some of those very large, families that held, huge amount of landholdings,
Yes.
some of them are even thinking about immigrating to the United States or Europe just as a safety net for them. Just in
even if they're well-to-do,
Right.
as far as their affluence or their ownership of land.
Right, exactly.
And with this very fascinating explanation by Candace about the political life of Egyptians in Upper Egypt in the decade of the 50s, we'll have to end our episode here today. So you would tune in next time. As we continue the discussion of politics, of course. Part 2, we'll talk about politics of the Copts on both sides, in the homeland, the diaspora, and the transnational dynamics that occur, as well as what really is Coptic identity in light of all this. Please stay tuned.